Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Anu Murthy. She's an attorney, and today's Kevin MD article is A Lawyer's Guide to Physician Side Gigs. Anu, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate being on here.
All right, let's start by briefly sharing your story, then we'll jump right into your Kevin MD article.
Okay, so I'm the black sheep of my family. My brothers are both doctors, and I went to law school instead, much to the dismay of my parents. But as I said, I come from a physician family, and this is all I've done my entire professional career is work with physicians on their contract issues, their business issues, etc. I did spend some time in-house at hospital systems for about a dozen years, and I really learned more about the employer side so that I can bring that experience also to my clients. And I was a lobbyist working in DC for about a year on payment reform, value-based payment reform.
Excellent. And your Kevin MD article, I think, is very relevant because a lot of doctors are exploring non-clinical opportunities or other clinical opportunities outside their regular job. So I think this is very relevant. Your Kevin MD article, A Lawyer's Guide to Physician Side Gigs. Tell us what it's about for those who didn't get a chance to read it.
Sure. So this was motivated by my experience during the pandemic. I'd always worked with physicians on their employment contracts, partnership agreements, but then during the pandemic, when some physicians were laid off or their compensation was cut, et cetera, they were at home or telecommuting, et cetera. I just had some physician clients reach out to me and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this side gig in order for me to bring in some extra income. I have some time. And really, they ranged from anything from writing a book, starting a coaching business, to, inventing and trying to patent an invention, things like that. I had several clients who started staffing companies during the pandemic, and a number of physicians decided to coach. So those were the things that were happening during the pandemic. And I realized that they needed legal help. It wasn't just a matter of starting a business. They needed to know, first and foremost, if they were in an employment situation, whether or not their current employment situation, a 1099 or W-2, would even allow them to pursue this side gig, even if they were laid off or otherwise, not fully employed at the time. They still had to follow the requirements of any contractual agreements that they had. The other thing I was really worried about was, folks doing side gigs or pursuing these passion projects that may not be legally protected, that would expose them to liability. So I wanted to talk to my clients about setting up the correct legal structure, setting up the correct, taxation, paying taxes, et cetera. That was really important. So I always encourage them to talk to a couple of people aside from me, a financial advisor, a CPA, et cetera, just to make sure that they were setting things up correctly. A lot of physicians saw this as a way of not just increasing income, but bringing some balance to their lives to do something that was not only enjoyable, but creative as well, and it belonged to them. So that's how I got involved in the physician side gig business. And I will tell you, many years ago, we tried a side gig in investing in real estate, and that just went so poorly that I haven't tried a side gig in the interim. But there's just so many more opportunities now for physicians. It's not just sort of traditional locums, et cetera. It is, a lot of non-clinical things in consulting for industry, pharma, et cetera.
And that last point really resonates. One of the themes of my site and the podcast is that physicians are more than our degrees, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I talk to so many physicians, like you said, they do physician coaching. Obviously, I see patients, but I also have this podcast, so I have my own side gig as well. And there are some legal hurdles sometimes that physicians have to overcome in order to pursue their side gigs, right? So let's talk about the first point that you mentioned about whether their initial contract, whether it's a W-2 or 1099, even allows physicians to have side gigs. So typically, when physicians sign their contract, it could be an academic medical center practice or healthcare institutions. What do you typically see regarding the legal language allowing or not allowing physicians to pursue activities outside that employment contract?
That's a great question. In almost every contract I review, there is a stipulation that says, the physician or the employee is being engaged to work full-time and exclusively for the employer. And that word exclusively is very important because employers, when they are hiring you, they want to make sure that they are getting your full attention, as it were, during working hours. Now, of course, there are, things that you can do outside of providing medical services or clinical services that they may not worry so much about. So some of the things that they're concerned about is that they may not want you to work for the competition. They may not want you to work in certain industries such as pharma and device. Sometimes hospital systems especially seem to have some restrictions on that. They also want to make sure you're not engaging in an activity that could disparage them. So they want to make sure you're working for a reputable company and that you're not using any other resources that the employer is providing. That's including their office space, computers, other, support staff, et cetera. You should not be doing that. And I think one of the most important things that an employer looks at is, will you have separate liability insurance to engage in those outside activities? So the key is disclosure, being transparent, getting advance written permission from the employer, providing all the information that they may need, and then engaging in any outside activities. Now, again, these are typically for something that is related to healthcare. If you want to give guitar lessons or if you want to Airbnb, that's different. You probably don't need advance written permission from your employer.
So hypothetically, let's say physician coaching. I have a lot of physicians who want to cut back on their clinical time and
Mhm.
become a physician coach. So they approach their employer and they're transparent in terms of what they want to do. In general, how reasonable are employers in allowing their physicians to pursue health-related side gigs?
I find that they're pretty reasonable. They're not going to withhold consent. Again, as long as it's, not for the competition. Sometimes, expert witness testimony, for example, they may not give you consent to do that if you are going to be getting paid to provide testimony against someone in the system that you're working for. Now, of course, if you get subpoenaed, compelled to testify, that's different. But in general, most employers are, cognizant of physicians' needs and desires to do something outside of clinical work, and it's generational too. Almost every physician I speak to these days, even if they don't have something right now, they're like, yeah, but in future I may want to consult or I may want to write a book or may want to do something else. So I think employers are definitely looking at that. I had a recent client who was not allowed to work for an immediate competitor doing some consulting for them. And so, that's understandable.
How about an initial contract negotiation, even before, I guess, during that initial negotiation process, when a physician is thinking about joining a group? Should side gigs be mentioned? Should it be initially part of the contract that a physician can pursue something outside of clinical duties? When should that be approached?
I strongly believe that it should be approached even during the interview process. There are so many opportunities that come up right now, in terms of consulting, et cetera, telehealth work, et cetera. So I think, never say never, even if you as a physician think, oh, I only want to work this job. You never know when an opportunity comes up to do something outside of your, 9 to 5 full-time work. So talk about it and find out what the process is. They're not likely to just say, we're going to give you a wholesale approval to do anything that you want. So if you have something in mind, definitely talk to them about it and see what the process is. So start early on.
Now, have you heard any particular horror stories where a physician's side gig was in direct conflict of their employment agreement? And tell us about some of the potential
Mhm.
repercussions of that.
Sure. I don't know if I have horror stories, but I definitely have, some clients who, for example, I have a client who written a book and she does book tours and she does speaking engagements and everything. And unfortunately, her employer gives her a hard time every time she wants to do something like that, even though it is written into her contract that she's allowed to do so. They're just hyper vigilant about the audience that she speaks to. So they always want to make sure who's in attendance. Is it pharma? Is it industry? Is it, competitive in nature? I also have had some, unfortunate circumstances where I've had clients who have invented something or created something, whether it's some kind of intellectual property, and the employer tries to come and get a piece of the action when my client, when the physician has been trying to monetize that. So those are things to look out for. And intellectual property is a big issue. If you are going to start a business, any kind of business, and there is a possibility that you're going to monetize it and scale it and perhaps look to sell that business, you really, really want to make sure that you're protecting your intellectual property. And that includes also getting a trademark or copyright protection. I had another recent client who was trying to sell their business. They've scaled it, trying to sell their business, but they don't own their trademark. And the investors who are looking to buy the business, they're like, look, we don't want to be sued for trademark infringement, so you really need to take care of getting that trademark before you sell to us.
And in general, how reasonable are most healthcare employers when it comes to things like intellectual property? And if a physician makes a lot of money from their side gigs, do they have a case where they are entitled to some of those profits and revenues?
Well, yes and no. That's why I think that it's really important to look at the contract. Always treat your contract as the foundation of your relationship. And so, again, if you're working with a contracts attorney and you have some intellectual property that you're either developing or going to develop, you have even a kernel of an idea that you want to develop, get the protection early on. And nowadays, it's even, extends to physicians who have social media. A lot of dermatologists, for example, have social media accounts. And for those clients, I highly recommend, disclosing all your handles, all the accounts that you have, and making sure that the future employer, is signing off on your ability to retain all the content that you create under those handles and accounts. Otherwise, if you start getting into, lucrative collaboration agreements, brand sponsorship, etc., your employer may be able to receive part of that money. So always, again, look at the foundation of the contract and think about all the hypotheticals that could happen in your career and try to address them early on instead of trying to go back later and get into some kind of dispute with the employer.
Now let's talk about the second issue that you mentioned, and that's of malpractice. Let's say in this scenario, like we talk about, a physician is an influencer, has a social media side gig, or writes a book, or coaches. Tell us the type of malpractice insurance is typically required for these health adjacent activities.
Okay. Well, if it's clinical based activities, of course, you need to make sure you have a separate malpractice insurance. For some of the healthcare adjacent types of things, there are coaches insurance. I know that is a product that is available, but it's always a good idea again to speak to an insurance broker to make sure that whatever you're engaging in outside of your primary employment, that you're covered under your medical liability insurance. Check to see if you need anything else. And, obviously, if you're doing something like, I don't know, starting a restaurant or something, there's all kinds of licenses and insurances that you need for that. But in general, you don't need liability insurance unless you're providing clinical services.
Has there been cases where a physician has been sued for malpractice because of their side gig, as far as you know?
As far as I know, I don't. I'm not a litigator, so I personally have not had any of my clients who've come to me and said, "Hey, I'm being sued because of this." And if unfortunately, I would have to refer them out to a litigation specialist.
But in general, an employer's malpractice insurance generally doesn't cover health adjacent activities outside that clinic, the main job clinical spectrum. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We're talking to Anu Murthy. She's an attorney, and today's Kevin MD article is A Lawyer's Guide to Physician Side Gigs. Anu, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Okay, so if you're thinking about a side gig, look to your contract. Have an attorney take a look at it, make sure that you're complying with all the requirements of disclosure and getting advanced permission. That's really important. Talk also to an attorney about the legal entity that you want to have for your side gig. Talk to a CPA about paying taxes. You don't want to be caught unawares of paying the required quarterly taxes, et cetera. If you have intellectual property, protect it. It just costs a few $1,000s to protect a trademark. And if you monetize this and scale it, and you're thinking about selling your side gig, your business that you created, you have to own the intellectual property.
Anu, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight, and thanks again for coming on the show.
You're welcome. Thank you.